you? All right. Well, thank you for being here. My name is Ashley Kilroy, and I'm the Executive Director for the Department of Excise and Licenses in Denver. Prior to being the Director of Excise and Licenses, I had been in safety for a couple of years, and then for 3 years, my team and I were in the mayor's office, and we were called the Office of Marijuana Policy. For the first 3 years of legalization of marijuana, overseeing the implementation of marijuana and getting it rolled out throughout all of the agencies in the city. So those first couple of years, starting in 2014, 15, and 16, were really all about just figuring out what we had before us, how we were going to take this brand new policy and implement it. After getting through the first 3 years, the mayor then transitioned our team over to the Department of Excise and Licenses, because when you think about it, marijuana is just another license, just like our liquor license and our food truck license and our animal shelter license. So we're all housed over there now. So it's my pleasure to welcome you here to Denver, whether you're from somewhere else in Colorado or another state or even another country. We're honored to have you here today to share our experiences with you and to hear what you guys are doing and to learn from you as well. So I know many of you have probably been here before to this conference. This is a really unique symposium. This is our 3rd year doing it. From what we can see, I think it's probably one of the few, if the only in the country, that really is all about marijuana management from a regulator perspective. This is a regulator-to-regulator conference, so you will be hearing from other regulators about how they've been implementing marijuana in all of the different areas, the different agency areas, and the different policy areas. I don't think anywhere else you'll find such a great collection of dedicated public servants who are really on the leading edge of marijuana management. And just given that we're all working on marijuana, you all here and we here are hosting really are visionaries trying to figure out, how do we do this? How do we build this regulatory framework from the ground up with really no role model? Here in Denver, what you're going to hear a lot about is we've taken a collaborative approach to managing marijuana. As I said initially, we had the five few small team members of ours housed in the mayor's office. But we quickly realized overseeing the implementation of marijuana policy involved multiple agencies, from environmental health, from food safety, environmental quality, to the Denver Police Department, the Denver Fire Department, community planning and development, our building inspectors, our electrical inspectors, our mechanical inspectors, Treasury, like looking at tax issues, and even all the way to 311, because once we started implementing, we immediately got multiple phone calls. So we took this collaborative approach where we had this small office housed in the mayor's office, but where we were meeting, we had very structured, formal meetings, meeting with the different agencies weekly, if not daily, very formal weekly meetings and then monthly meetings, but then we were always in contact with those other agencies. And this symposium is just an extension of that collaborative model. This symposium, it's just as valuable to us and to you to have that collaboration beyond just Denver, beyond our state, and even beyond our country. So we hope you guys are going to learn a lot from us here today and that we'll learn from you as well. Many of you are seeing this play out in your jurisdictions right now, and whether or not you voted for it, you are likely, you wouldn't be here today if you weren't going to have some role in implementation. And implementing a new policy issue like this goes to the fundamental basis of what we all do as city employees and city regulators. This is what we do all the time, whether it's marijuana or some other issue, whether it's implementing a new policy that your city council has passed or a new law that the state's passed. It's fundamental to what we do, and we've got to get it right. The launch of any new program at the outset is definitely the riskiest, and the beginning things that we do and put in place are what's going to frame it for ongoing. It's harder to backtrack once you've got some policies in place. So it's really important that we're all on board, we're all talking to each other, and we're all moving forward together. And we also think about, when we think about that collaboration, that if Alaska is doing something similar to Colorado and Colorado is doing something similar to California, that we sort of start building best practices and a common understanding that we can rely on each other as we move forward with marijuana policy. So thanks again for being here. I hope you learn a lot. We look forward to having more time with you during breaks. We also are going to have a happy hour, a little reception this afternoon. So please plan on doing that and have fun in these 2 days packed full of everything you ever wanted to know about marijuana. Thank you. So next, we've got two great individuals here with us who've helped to make us, help to support us and help to make us successful. We have Ed Dale from Acela, who will speak first, and then we have Dan Pabon, one of our state representatives, who's going to speak second. So I'll first introduce Ed. Ed is the CEO of Acela, and Acela is the leading provider of cloud-based productivity and civic engagement solutions for government. He's a seasoned leader with a passion for transforming government. Ed joined Acela in March to lead the next phase of growth for the company, and he will take Acela to the next level. As CEO, Ed brings 4 decades of government, SaaS, and systems integration experience to Acela. So please join me in welcoming Ed Dale.
Thank you, Ashley. The only part about that announcement I flinched a little bit is the 4 decades. It just came quick. How many people here in the audience thought, 10 years ago you'd be attending a marijuana management symposium? Not me. But here we are, and with a great deal of change going about us. At Acela, leading provider of marijuana management, and our solutions include licensing, permitting, inspection, and land management. We're proud to be a sponsor of this symposium and really support the efforts of the City of Denver and all of you in achieving a smooth and rapid transition to a regulated marketplace. And we're just proud to be here. And I want to thank Denver for their efforts in this. They were a first mover in the market and one of the first cities to go into this space. And as I look at the agenda, I think we have people from Indonesia and the Netherlands and other cities and states that are attending. So I'm looking forward to learning things today myself, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and also the fact that I'm a Colorado resident myself, live down in Castle Rock, so we're a Silicon Valley-based company. I leave here every Monday morning and come back on Thursday, so I got an extra day here in Colorado today. I'm going to just give you a 2-minute little ad on Acela and what we do and how our relationship evolved with Denver, and then I'll turn it over to our more important speaker than I. So Acela is a Silicon Valley-based company. We have about 2,200 clients around the United States and globally. And we basically build solutions, cloud-based solutions that are for permitting, licensing, inspection, and land management, and also ancillary areas like finance that go with it to support those in the marketplace. Denver was our first client in the marijuana management area, and with the success that we've had here and working with them and learning with Denver as we went live, we were able to leverage that across the marketplace, and we now have clients in Michigan, the state of California, and we just added Los Angeles last month to our list of clients. And what we've learned from this in the market was we tried to look at, I'm not so old that I can remember prohibition going away, but I can reflect on that, and I think this is the closest thing of that I can see historically of what's going on with marijuana as going away of prohibition. And, you know, I tried to think why don't we have a problem with people still having a lot of moonshine and stills and unlicensed bars and everything going on? And I think it was effective government that is not policing. I think it was effective services delivered by the government agencies that allowed this to happen. And I look at three things that happened. One, people didn't have to worry about the quality anymore. You didn't have to worry about, did someone blend wood alcohol into your drink, and you might have your eyesight impaired, or you might go completely blind by drinking this drink at an unlicensed bar. You also looked at the consistency. You didn't have to worry about if you bought a drink at a bar in Boulder or a bar in Castle Rock, that it was going to be a different consistency of quality as far as what percentage of alcohol was going to be in a beer. Was it 1%? Was it 12%? Was it 20%? We knew that it was consistency because there was government regulation and government quality. And that's the last word, is quality. The government regulation brought quality to the product. We knew that it was safe. We knew it was high quality. We knew it was, if it was something that needed to be refrigerated, we knew it was refrigerated. And you can think about all those things brought to the marijuana marketplace. I think those are things that we need to do to be successful in this market, is bringing a consistency, quality, and safety to the marketplace. And those are all things that we're trying to do at Excella. You know, things like making sure that the herbicides used on cannabis is not a carcinogen in the planting process. That, you know, when the THC level is the accurate in the edibles. You know, those are all things that we try to build in the solutions that we are developing to the marketplace. So, last little plug, we will be in the technology breakout sessions tomorrow afternoon, and some of our clients will be there as well, so please swing by and see us. And we're just, again, proud to be here, and thank you, Denver, for the opportunity to participate.
And next up, I'd like to introduce Representative Dan Pabon. Representative Pabon is the Colorado State Representative for District 4, Northwest Denver. He was elected in November of 2010 and entered office in January 2011. Representative Pabon has served as the State House Minority Leader from 2013 to 2014, and Representative Pabon earned his BSME in engineering from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2001, and later his JD from the University of Colorado School of Law in 2005. His professional experience includes working as a senior associate of Holland & Hart Limited Liability Partnership from 2005 to 2010, and as a member of the Obama-Biden Presidential Transition Team. Please join me in welcoming Representative Pabon.
Thank you, Ashley and Ed, for your opening remarks. Good morning, friends. Welcome to the state of Colorado and the Mile High City, Denver, Colorado. Now, I know you all know this, but we were called the Mile High City long before we had marijuana legalization in the city. So I just want to be clear about that. You know, it's such an honor to be part of this important conference. Whether you came from up the road in Thornton or flew in from San Diego or even as far away as Netherlands or Uruguay, we are proud to have you and share our experiences with you. Whether you were sent here because you are a policy expert or because you are supposed to be by the time you get home, we will do our best to enlighten and educate you. And I'll just say, truthfully, if you're like me and you've been involved in your jurisdiction's regulations from the beginning, you are an expert. Whether you have the actual bona fides to state that with any certainty is, of course, up to you, but I have developed a reputation for talking about implementing and debating marijuana, and some people would say cannabis policy, not only in the state of Colorado, but all across the country and all across the world. And the reason is I was involved from day one. But let me tell you about my involvement. It was very sheepish, very skittish, and very involuntary. It was 2012, so you've heard I've been elected since 2010. It was 2012. There were many different issues on the ballot. The president was about to be reelected. I was, as Ashley said, served on the Obama-Biden transition team, so that was a candidate who was near and dear to my heart. There were a lot of different issues that were in front of us, and one of them was this small, very unknown ballot initiative to regulate marijuana like alcohol in Colorado. And for those who were paying attention to it, our governor, our mayor, many higher level elected officials were all very adamantly opposed to that ballot initiative. Law enforcement, you name it, and basically there were a lot of unified opposition to this ballot initiative in Colorado. This might surprise you, given the state of the world today in 2017. So there were two legislators who supported the ballot initiative. I was not one of them. I was asked about my interest in supporting this ballot initiative, and I said, I am going to vote no on this. Not because I don't necessarily believe it's the right policy, but I don't want to be the guinea pig for the country and the world. That would be a terrible idea. Do you know how much work and time and energy and effort it's going to take to implement that? And of course, the proponent said, okay, well, as long as you won't publicly be against it, we're okay with that. So 2012 election came along. Amendment 64, as it was called, passed with 55% of the vote in Colorado, more votes than Barack Obama got, by the way. And here we were. Just 3 weeks after that ballot initiative, my now 5-year-old son, soon-to-be 5-year-old son, Alec, was born. And as I was thinking and getting ready for the legislative session in January of 2013, I thought, my young son is going to be born into a new world where marijuana legalization is the norm. And why should I sit back if I have an opportunity to weigh in and make sure that kids are protected in this, this is kept out of the hands of criminals and cartels, and actually have an opportunity to make some substantial policy? I went to the speaker, and I asked the speaker, who's going to be involved from the state legislature from our party in this project? And he looked at me like I was crazy and said, no one. No one has come to me to offer any help or support. Are you interested? And he couldn't believe that I would be interested. And I said, Mr. Speaker, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Yes, sign me up. I signed up, much to my chagrin, for about 2,000 hours of work over the course of the next year, both with working groups. The governor called a task force, about 50 people, involving law enforcement, child advocates, district attorneys, defense attorneys, law enforcement, you name it, we had it at the table, all from very different views across the spectrum about how this system should work. And we discussed and we debated for hours and hours upon end how much THC should be in a serving size of marijuana, how many plants should be allowed inside a residential facility versus a commercial facility. How many years should it be since a person who obtained a drug felony be not allowed to enter into the industry, and on and on and on and on. So the good news is, if these are conversations or discussions that you're having in your jurisdictions, there's a wealth of debate and discussion that happened here in Colorado that we're all happy to share. From that point, we took those 106 recommendations that came out of the governor's task force and we presented them to the legislature, because the legislature ultimately had to adopt the laws that were going to be implemented. After discussing how we were going to set up that structure, and this is emblematic of the work that we've done in Colorado, and I'll talk about that model a little bit more. But we decided that the Joint Select Task Force of Amendment 64 implementation should be comprised of equal members of the House and the Senate and equal members of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And that those 106 recommendations would be presented to us and we would vote on each and every single one, whether they should be included, whether they should be excluded, or whether we needed further information. And again, over the course of the next several weeks, 8 weeks to be exact, we developed 3 bills. One was called a consensus bill, where all Democrats, all Republicans, senators, and representatives agreed. One was called the non-consensus bill, where there was debate and discussion about how we should move forward. A lot of it had to do with the regulatory system, the felony rule, et cetera. And then the last piece was taxation. And in 2013, Colorado was the first legislature in the country to pass comprehensive marijuana cannabis regulatory reform or regulatory implementation. Then, of course, our partners at the City of Denver earnestly started their work once they had the framework for what that was. And so it was roughly about a 2-year effort that we undertook to make sure that the policies and the implementation was as successful as it could possibly be. And so January 1st, 2014 was the first day of sales in Colorado. And you may have heard about it or you may have not, because it was such a non-event. In other words, stores opened up, things happened, sales were made, and everyone, many of the consumers, of course, celebrated, but the rest of us watched and just looked at the system we had just built. So fast forward to 2017, whether you do this work now because you believe in social justice, criminal justice, civil liberty, law and order, public safety, or child safety, there is definitely a place for you in this work. And in my 5 years of working on this policy, and by the way, this is only one area of policy that I work on. There are many others in the State House. I've figured out that there are a couple of different ways that we approach as government policies. One is the traditional way, and one is the marijuana way. And the traditional way, and you can tell me if you can relate to this. Problem comes across your desk, and you take a look at it, and you realize, well, yeah, maybe there's an issue here, but really this is a state or federal issue. So you type up a nice response saying, please contact so-and-so agency, or write your congressman, or write your state legislature. And I know some of you do that because I've gotten a few of those letters on my desk. And then it gets to my desk and I look at it and I do the same thing. And so on and so on, and 12 weeks later, we all have identified and clearly and articulately conveyed how it is someone else's problem. Now the marijuana approach. We have a problem. It's definitely a federal problem, but there's no way that the federal government is going to help or assist in any real meaningful way on this issue. So that leaves us with state and local folks who are involved. And as you can see the collaboration between our state and local partners, it's really hard for Ashley to send me a letter and say, hey, this is a state problem, and me to send Ashley a letter and say, hey, this is a city problem, when we literally sit next to each other on many of these different issues. So what do? We collaborate. We discuss, we engage in a way that I think is both a powerful statement about what government can do when it proactively works together with all of its partners. Our founders came up with this idea of federalism, and then our state founders decided to divide up jurisdictions between state and local and city and everything else, with the idea that problems would be really, really hard to solve unless we work together. And this is a problem that's worth solving because it can be really, really hard. And most importantly, unlike most, the cameras, the newspapers, the TV stations really like this topic. The fact that marijuana is one of the top 3 Denver Post stories in any given day tells you a lot about how much people, or at least the media, focuses on this issue. The other 2, by the way, are the weather and the Denver Broncos. So when you have that type of microscope on the work that you're doing, it has been such a critical part of how we have been so successful in putting all this together. And I was asked to talk about the work at the state legislature that we've done, and I'll touch on a couple of things, but one of the things I think that is most important is that we get many of the issues that we tackle in the legislature are addressed or identified first by our local partners. Pesticides has been a big issue over the course of the last couple of years. There's no federal law governing pesticides as applied to marijuana right now. That probably doesn't surprise you. So there's a couple of alternatives. One, the state creates its own EPA-level oversight of pesticides in the state of Colorado. That's a pretty enormous task and takes a lot of resources to do. Or we work with the regulators who are ultimately on the ground, who have experience in health safety inspections. That's not necessarily the state, that's our local partners in Colorado. And so we relied on the city of Denver to give us the information we needed to develop a statewide policy that made sense both with the science and with safety. And so we have, and we are still learning about the implications of that policy on a statewide basis. The biggest thing we've done over the course of the last couple of years is implement a research license. And this might be of interest to some of you, not necessarily from the regulatory point of view, but just the world that we live in. So many folks who are interested in cannabis, or marijuana as it may be called, are interested in it because of the medicinal effects. And they've heard anecdotally, and maybe you have too, about a pain treatment application, whether it's a patch or CBD oil or whatever it may be, has fundamentally changed the outcome for cancer patients, for children suffering from epilepsy, and from seniors who are experiencing chronic pain. And you take these anecdotes and you listen to them, and maybe then you or your grandmother, your aunt, or your neighbor uses the same thing and has the same result. All things that happen in the United States of America. But what we usually pride ourselves on is making sure that the science backs up the anecdote. And right now, federal law has a large prohibition on the research for the efficacy of cannabis in its application. What we decided in Colorado in this last year is to give research institutions and public companies the opportunity to engage in a public-private partnership to develop more of this research. And what we're hoping to see is that we'll take those anecdotes that exist, but at the same time have the science tell us, right or wrong, whether or not this is actually having a profound effect as we're seeing it in many of the applications. I mention this because I think there are many institutions and jurisdictions across the state and the country who are interested in developing this science as well. And so if we look to science to guide us through this process, it not only legitimizes the work that we do as regulators and as policymakers, but it also gives us an opportunity to look at an alternative medicine or alternative healing mechanism that we may not have ever contemplated before this industry came about. And it's unique because many, obviously, of our health delivery systems are fairly and uniquely controlled by a set of industries, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry, the nutraceutical industry, or what have you. Cannabis, the way that it's been designed and the way it's been thought of, is more from the people and the grassroots piece. That, again, can be a challenge as regulators as you try to implement that policy. But I commend you very much for being here, because the launch of any new program can be risky. The public's perception of success or failure, regardless of the realities, can have long-lasting effects on their view of effectiveness of their government, and you're right in the crosshairs of it. I can say that doing your best in this is all you can do. So I invite you to embrace this change, roll with the punches, continue the tradition or create a tradition of collaboration that we've started, and continue evolving and innovating to make your communities safer and stronger. The regulatory, enforcement, and educational challenges of this industry are immense, but through collaboration and innovation, we will overcome these challenges and our communities will flourish. So again, thank you for being here. I know you will learn so much during the next 2 days, and it's an honor to be with you today. Best of luck.
All right. Thank you very much, Ed and Dan. We really appreciate you being here today. Thank you. And so they will move off the stage. We're going to move on to our national roundtable, where we are going to have some other representatives from other cities join us. We have Brandon Goldner from Portland, David Mendoza from Seattle, and Betsy Cavendish from DC. So you all make your way to the stage. Have you already been mic'd up?
Yes.
Okay. And I guess I need mine to be turned on. My mic back here to be turned on.
Hi. Nice to meet you, Betsy.
Okay.
Betsy, I'm Brandon. Hi, I'm Brandon.
So what we decided to do is have us, as the national roundtable, sort of sit here in these chairs to be able to really kind of have a back and forth. We're going to talk a little bit about what each of the different cities' model looks like, and then we'll each throw out questions and kind of have that back and forth, then open it up to questions for you guys. So until I get my mic turned on, I will just turn it over to you all to introduce yourself. And I guess, Brandon, you are mic'd?
Yes.
Yes. Have Brandon go ahead, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your model and your job.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Brandon Goldner. I'm the coordinator of the City of Portland's cannabis program housed in the Office of Neighborhood Involvement. So I lead a team of 7 staff, one of whom is here today, Nate Werner from our compliance team. Thank you, Nate. So I've been with the program for about 2 years, but have just been in my role as the coordinator for just a little while. So the City of Portland has a standalone cannabis licensing program where cannabis businesses that are cited in the City of Portland have to meet our requirements, and also work with other bureaus within the city to make sure that things like their business tax is taken care of, that the permitting for their locations is all straightened out. So our program is a standalone program, but works pretty closely with the state of Oregon and with other bureaus within the city, and also works closely with Commissioner Chloe Eudaly. So the City of Portland has a commission-style form of government where commissioners oversee particular bureaus. And again, I work for the Office of Neighborhood Involvement. So that's about it for me as far as introductions are concerned.
Hi, I'm David Mendoza. I'm a senior policy advisor in the Seattle Mayor's Office of Policy Innovation. And I started there in 2014, and once we got there, we had the issue of gray market medical marijuana that had exploded in the 2 years after Initiative 502, our initiative for recreational marijuana, had passed. And so the state was going to license 23 retail stores for recreational purposes, but we had ballooned from 45 medical to 108.20 medical. And so we created our own licensing program, a regulatory business license, and we had a collaborative interdepartmental team that consisted of our business licensing, our building and permits construction, SPD, fire, a bunch of other departments as well, to help come up with this solution. And with this regulatory business license, we created a system of civil penalties. And our folks really embraced this work. We had our own city inspectors purchase medical marijuana undercover without medical authorizations. That served as a basis for search warrants. We went back with our inspectors and just uniformed police officers, seized product at 5 locations. The owners faced a misdemeanor violations for not having the right business license. But through that process and through other fines we assessed to folks, we were able to shutter 118 of those medical marijuana stores without licenses, without resorting on heavy-handed criminal police tactics, felony criminal charges, and we helped integrate the market into a unified recreational and medical system.
Hi, I'm Betsy Cavendish. I'm Mayor Bowser's General Counsel in Washington, D.C. And we have kind of a hybrid system. We decriminalized marijuana a few years ago. And then we had Initiative 71 in 2014 that provided for home grow and home use, limited home grow. It's like 3 mature plants at a time or 6 per household. And we have a medical marijuana regime. We have 334 physicians registered and 47 advanced practice nurses, 11 naturopaths, 10 physician assistants, and 5 dentists registered in that. And we're a mid-sized city that's very embedded in Maryland, which is moving also toward medical marijuana, and Virginia, which is a prohibition state. And we work 3.5 blocks away from Attorney General Jeff Sessions. And as soon as our Initiative 71 passed and we were standing up legal home grow, home use, Congress passed a law prohibiting us from moving to a legal sales regime. So we have the anomalous situation of it's legal to use marijuana, but it's illegal to buy marijuana.
So here in Colorado, we've had medical marijuana since 2000, 17 years. Our voters voted in favor of medical marijuana in 2000, and for a while, most people were still underground. People didn't really know if they could believe that that was actually going to be allowed. And then the federal government issued what was then the Ogden Memo that said was similar to the later Cole Memorandum, but the Ogden Memo said that for states that had legalized medical marijuana markets, as long as the states had strict rules and robust enforcement, that the federal government would sort of would make enforcement of marijuana laws their lowest priority. So medical passed in 2000. We're kind of in this gray area. That memo, the Ogden Memo, came out in 2009. And then shortly after that, like 2010, we just saw an explosion of marijuana businesses here in Denver. They came up and they opened before we had a chance to get our regulations in place. So that's why you'll still see a lot of marijuana businesses sort of clustered along Broadway or clustered along Colfax. That was a result of them coming in before we had our regulations. We then got our regulations in place in 2010. First the state, under Representative Pabon, passed the Colorado Medical Marijuana Code in 2010. We followed shortly with the Denver Medical Marijuana Code, and we had area restrictions that these businesses could not be within 1,000 feet of each other, 1,000 feet of drug and rehab treatment facilities, 1,000 feet of daycare facilities, 1,000 feet of schools. We also put in our zoning at that time. Then our voters voted in favor of retail marijuana in 2012 with implementation in 2014. We carried on all those distance restrictions at that time, but we also added a 3.5% sales tax on the retail marijuana to help us fund implementation. Our current landscape right now is that we have about 1,100 individual licenses operating out of about 480 unique locations. We have about 220 stores, 300 grows, and 85 marijuana manufacturers. And then I guess one last thing to say before we kick it off, our revenue, you might have read recently, the papers have been, the articles have been out recently that marijuana so far this year is already over $1 billion. Last year it was 1.6 billion, but that still is less than 1% of our overall GDP in the state of Colorado. So we're now going to have a conversation. I know Betsy had some questions that she threw out at us during our telephone call. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll turn it over to questions from you guys. So Betsy.
So I'm leading the discussion on equity, and with decriminalization, we eliminated a very famous cause of inequity, namely the over-criminalization or the disparate criminalization of marijuana arrests. And in the district, in 2012, we had 3,085 arrests for possession of marijuana that were heavily concentrated in the African American community. And with decriminalization, that's dropped to about the x-axis for possession. We still have some other criminal offenses for distribution or public consumption, but we eliminated a pretty poignant and prominent cause of inequity or source of inequity with decriminalization. But that doesn't mean we've solved all the equity problems. And as Representative Pavone was talking about, this is a pervasive regulatory structure for marijuana, and we try to think about equity as we implement every program. So some of the components of equity in the regime we're in now concern issues like where are our distribution and cultivation centers located? What's the access for people to participate either as patients or as owners? Do they have access to capital? What kind of enforcement problems are still left? Anyway, there are lots of different components to equity, but I was wondering from my colleagues how you're thinking about equity in the realm of Seattle and Portland, and what components figure into equity as you're regulating now.
Sure, yeah, there's a little bit I can talk about when we first established our program, and then a little bit I can talk about what we're doing now. So the city of Portland has a 1,000-foot buffer between retailers and medical dispensaries to prevent oversaturation of those kinds of businesses in Portland's business landscape. One of the considerations that the city of Portland had to make was whether to expand those buffers to other kinds of locations, like perhaps daycares, parks, things of that nature. During those discussions, and I don't think I mentioned that our program came into being in late 2015, so some of these policy discussions were happening in late 14 and then through 15. One of the considerations that was made was looking at a map of Portland and just simply looking at where are those resources like parks, like daycare centers, things of that nature. And when you looked at the map of Portland, you noticed that the more underserved areas of the city didn't have those amenities. And so if Portland were to have adopted a framework that had a buffer from parks, then it would have pushed a lot of those businesses into areas of the cities that lacked parks. And so that, for the city of Portland and the policymakers at the time, was an issue of equity. And so that piece was dropped off. And so we were just left with the 1,000-foot buffers from retailers and from dispensaries. And despite that, our business landscape is relatively robust. I think we have about 130 licensed retailers in the city right now. I think more retailers than Starbucks actually in the city as it stands. So that was one consideration that the city made early on. Now what we're doing, I'm really excited to talk about some of this work, and if you plug for the finance panel tomorrow, if you go, you'll hear me talk more about it. The city of Portland adopted a 3% local tax on cannabis at the point of sale, and $500,000 of that tax is going to be used to be spent through a restorative justice lens, thinking about record clearing, thinking about expungement, thinking about small business support, particularly for women-owned and minority-owned businesses. And so Commissioner Chloe Eudaly and Commissioner Amanda Fritz are convening a steering committee made up of minority business owners and consultants, folks who help with record clearing and expungement and economic development, to think about are there existing programs in Portland right now that are doing that good work where that money could go to and help correct some of those inequities created from the war on drugs? And so there's a lot more that the city could be doing and that we're hopeful to be doing in the future moving forward with respect both to our program and to with taxes, but that's something in particular that I'm excited about in the coming year.
Thank you. David, is there an equity topic in Portland that you'd like
In
to
Seattle,
share?
yeah, there's
I mean, in
a
Seattle,
few
pardon me.
areas,
That
and I
was
think
Portland,
a lot of lessons in what not to do, perhaps. Starting off with the buffer zone conversation, in Washington State, we have a very lengthy list of entities that we have to be cited marijuana businesses have to be cited 1,000 feet away from. Parks, libraries, schools, community centers, long list of folks, and that created a system where those neighborhoods where those kind of amenities aren't present would have an influx of businesses. After the first year or so of Initiative 502 passed, the state legislature had a massive reform that integrated medical marijuana into a unified system, but also gave local jurisdictions the ability to lower buffer zones. And so we did that. We lowered our buffer zones from 1,000 to 500 feet in most instances for the retail stores, in some neighborhoods as low as 250. In order to get more stores into downtown to address the illegal dealing that was happening on the streets in downtown Seattle, but also to try to open up more neighborhoods so they weren't just all clumped into certain neighborhoods. We also created a buffer zone between retail stores, and so you could have 2 retail stores next to each other, but the third would have to be 1,000 feet away. Current work we've done for the last 3 years is continue to advocate for lowered criminal penalties. If right now in Washington State, if you have an ounce of marijuana, totally legal and fine if you're an adult over 21. If you have 1.25 ounces, you are now a felon. We think that step is a bit too far and intense, and so we've been advocating to have a misdemeanor between 1.2 and 2 ounces for folks that way to continue to address the inequity in criminal prosecutions. And I think the lesson...
Can I butt in? Have you had record sealing for offenses that are no longer criminal?
No, we have also been advocating for that as well. That's been included in some more recent statewide legislative packages, and I wish it had been included in ours, but we've been running into kind of old excuses of why not to move on either the misdemeanor reduction or vacating of criminal penalties of aren't we being soft on crime by moving forward on those, which is, I find, a little frustrating in this new realm.
So we have interesting equity issues on both geography and looking back at the past and what the current criminal penalties are. We have landlord issues, like who's an owner and who's a renter, because, of course, if you are an owner, you can smoke marijuana at your house. But if you're a renter, it's still up to the landlords. And so some people think that's an equity issue that's a tough one to solve for. And also people in public housing, of course, are subject to federal law, which bans use of marijuana.
Yeah, it's also been one of our reasons for advocating for social consumption lounges at the state legislature. Our state legislature went the other way on allowance for that. There was a gray area, and then when they did that integration, they made it a felony for any business to have any social consumption on their premises.
Brandon, did you want to say something?
Just to second that point on social consumption, same thing for the city of Portland. We've testified in support of a regulatory framework for social consumption. And right now in Oregon, there's a regulatory gray area about consuming cannabis outside your home. If you meet a certain list of qualifiers, if it's on private property, outside of public view, if you bring your own cannabis, if you're over 21, you can consume. So we've been trying to work within what's legal currently at the state and local level to provide guidance on those temporary events where people could consume cannabis. But yes, I agree with both of you. The city of Portland does see social consumption as an equity issue for that reason.
Thanks, Brandon. One other equity issue that we are studying but haven't solved relates to this disconnect between growing social usage and continued penalties for jobs, or bars for jobs, and the lack of awareness of how doing something legal can have ramifications for your employment prospects. So, of course, there's still federal law that relates to all federal contractors, Drug-Free Workplace Act. We have local law on child safety and health, so all the daycares and schools. certainly at the daycare level, there's pre-employment testing. Many private employers have pre-employment testing. And our job training programs, we put 21 people through a program to train them to be electricians, and 17 peed dirty and couldn't get licensed after a big effort to provide pathways to the middle class. 20% of our sort of students or persons in our job training programs do have marijuana in their systems, and that's a bar to many jobs, and many good jobs. The jobs at the public utilities start at $38 an hour, average is $48 an hour. Linesmen can make over $100,000 a year, and you can't get jobs in those fields, and people may not understand. So it's a complicated, we find that to be a complicated messaging situation to let people know, yeah, you may be legally allowed to do it, but it may not bear out so well for your career prospects. Is that something you're dealing with in Portland and Seattle?
Well, it's not something that the city is directly engaging in, but it's certainly a consideration. My understanding is when Measure 91 passed in Oregon, that there was a tag on there that said, this wouldn't affect the employer's ability to choose who they can and cannot hire. It doesn't mean that the legislature can't go back and change that now. They certainly could. But my understanding is because of lobbying from business trade organizations that's been difficult politically in Oregon. But that's certainly something that Portland has its eye on. If there were a concept like that, my sense is that we would support it for all the reasons that you just stated.
Yeah, and in Seattle, it's been, in the initial year or so after legalization, it was a topic that was being discussed by advocates, by the legislature. I used to work at the state legislature for the first couple of years before coming to the mayor's office. And then it just kind of disappeared. There's no one raising the questions. In terms of our own work at Seattle, I think we've been more focused on the topics I've already talked about. And in terms of employment issues, we've kept our employers busy with our minimum wage and predictive scheduling laws. And so that's been the focus of our interaction with employers. And there hasn't been a push from really any level on this issue.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
We have just a huge press for an equity standpoint to close this wealth gap in the District of Columbia.
Right.
We have a booming economy and many people coming in for great jobs, and we have some stubborn unemployment in certain parts of the city, and we're trying to get people into job training programs and into jobs, and it is an important critical pathway to the middle class to be able to get good jobs, and if those tests are there, it's a problem.
So what solutions are you guys looking at? Are you looking towards reducing the levels of convictions in your state statutes?
Well, we too are moving for closing records from past convictions, but this is about current testing, and there are technological limits, and there's an architecture of federal law, and there are good reasons not to have people who are stoned taking care of young children and that kind of thing, or electricians. So I'm identifying it more as a problem than to present really good solutions. Like, we all know that people can metabolize alcohol at about, a drink an hour or so, but marijuana stays in your system a lot longer. And so if you have pre-employment testing, we can't even advise people on how long you have to have abstained in order to pass a pre-employment test. And then despite all the fabulously important laws to prevent against discrimination against persons with disabilities, people who may be using medical marijuana may get kicked out, and it could be a pretext for employer discrimination against persons, say, with epilepsy or Parkinson's or cancer or something like that. And so, we need to go very strongly against employers who are discriminating against persons with various diseases that they may be self-treating with medical marijuana.
Well,
but it's a problem that doesn't have a lot of clear solutions, and private employers have the prerogative to do much of this testing. So it's not just government testing for those jobs at Parks and Rec and schools and so forth, but I think that part of the solution is communicating to people that it may be legal, but it may not think very carefully about what job you have or want to have and how it may play out.
Right, right. Well, in Colorado, under Representative Pabone's leadership, we do have a statute right now that allows for people to petition the courts to have their records sealed for crimes that they may have been convicted of or charged with that are now would not be crimes. So if someone had been convicted of possession of marijuana, less than an ounce of marijuana, that's no longer illegal now, and they can petition the court to have that sealed. But you're right, it doesn't really get to the issue of people who are now being tested, doing something legal off-duty conduct, being tested for a job, and then maybe being denied the job even if they're not intoxicated, but because they still have that level of THC in their blood, in their body. And I think you're right. I think it's a tough issue, and I think that employers, especially when you have safety, employees working in safety-sensitive positions, should have that ability to make their own decisions along those lines, and just, kind of from our end, which I'm sure you guys are doing in your cities as well, our mayor has sort of broad equity goals with regard to have sort of adopted the ban the box, where we're no longer asking people right off the bat when they apply for a job with the city whether or not they've had a conviction, so they can at least get past that first hurdle, and then when they get down to final kind of getting down to the final candidates, if it is a safety sensitive position, we might look into that. The mayor also adopted some legislation and issued an executive order that would really help benefit women-owned and minority-owned businesses. Maybe to get to it from that way, not necessarily addressing the marijuana issues. So I know, anything else on that?
No, but do you want to talk about any other equity issues that you've addressed in Denver?
So, sure. One of the things too that we did with the tax revenue. So our tax revenue, that 3.5% additional, so our tax revenue last year brought in about $36 million. About $10 million of that was just specifically from that marijuana special sales tax. We've put $4.8 million towards affordable housing. We've done about $10 million to deferred maintenance on capital improvements, and just this year put $500,000 towards opioid prevention. So we've had a couple of other things. We also made public consumption, our city council made public consumption a non-criminal violation. So no longer would somebody be charged criminally for that. So we help stop that perpetuation of that impact of the war on drugs on what it had on our low and minority, our low income and moderate income people.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead. One more quick point, Ashley, as you mentioned the opportunities for folks to clear their records. One thing to think about is that, yeah, those opportunities may be available, but people may not know how to access them. Yes. And that's been a huge issue in Portland and something that we're looking at very deeply with some of this tax money for record clearing and expungement. Simply meeting people where they are, making sure they're aware of these services and so that they can take advantage of them is extraordinarily important.
Just one issue on social equity I'd like to address is that we didn't address in Washington State was when I first started, we had very dominant medical marijuana industry that was very diverse, relatively speaking, to the current state of the industry. A variety of women owners and people of color, and that's almost entirely shifted to white men owning the industry. And so as folks are setting up their own systems in other states, I really want to highlight the program set up in Oakland, their social equity program they set up there, where they set aside they have 8 total licenses. Half those licenses will be going towards people who make 80% or less of the Oakland average median income, have passed marijuana convictions, or have lived in areas of high law enforcement. And it's a way to ensure those who have been most negatively impacted by the war on drugs have an opportunity to have an ownership stake in the industry moving forward.
All right, well, maybe turning to another subject, when we had our call, when we were preparing for this, David had some questions about what we were doing with home grows and what he's doing with home grows in Seattle. So do you want to kick that off for us?
Unique amongst the states that have allowed for legal recreational marijuana, Washington does not allow adult home grow unless you have a medical authorization. And so from our pure regulatory perspective, it's been a little bit of a blessing. I think it's one less source of, we've seen our illicit market is now entirely in homes. This past year, I can get the exact number right here, seized 6,100 plants, 43,000 grams, served warrants in 24 locations this year. And so it's a huge source of illicit market. The state legislature has directed our Liquor and Cannabis Board to make a recommendation to them by the end of this year on whether to allow home grows in Washington State. And we submitted our own letter expressing our concerns, essentially asking for the status quo, because the options they provided us to comment on were a highly regulated state system or a highly regulated local system. And unlike some of the jurisdictions here, regulating cannabis is a money-losing proposition for the city in that we only got a couple $100,000 in revenue from marijuana sales in the city. There's no dedicated percentage of the sales going towards the city. There's a $20 million fund that the state legislature set aside for all cities and counties in the state to share. And that's about the only direct money we get, with some regular sales tax, but that's not a significant source. And so our concern was twofold. If local regulation or state regulation would be, now we're regulating and inspecting people's homes, we have privacy concerns there, and the amount of work that would take to do. And so I would just trying to see if home grow moves forward in some manner moving forward, what lessons you've seen, how would you caution us to try to regulate to get ahead of any of the concerns around illicit home grow, fires, odor control, those kinds of things that we're concerned about?
We have pretty strict plant limits in Washington, so 6 per person, 3 that are in flower at any one time, and 6 in flower at a household. Ours is all indoors, so we don't have people growing in the backyard and a lot of trespassing and that kind of thing. And following a visit last year to Seattle and Denver, where we took some good pointers from you all, we started regulating the use of butane and substances that can lead to home explosions. We have not had a lot of complaints from neighbors about odor because it's a small amount that people are allowed to have at home for growing, but for smoking, there was one case in Superior Court where there was a common wall and someone was a frequent user and the smell was going into the baby's room next door, and they got an injunction against someone smoking pot in their own household because of the common venting system. But we haven't had a lot of complaints. So my main recommendations would be plant limits and explosion situations, no butane at home.
Yeah, so Oregon allows adults to grow 4 plants at the home, but a total of 4 in the household, so you can't stack the 4 on top of each other. The interesting point on regulating home grows for Portland has been that the state of Oregon has a licensing structure and the city has a licensing structure, but the state of Oregon does not have the regulatory authority to enforce for folks who have not applied for a state license or who are not licensed by the state. So essentially, if I were living in a neighborhood and I noticed there's a house across the street, the windows were blacked out and it seemed like there were cannabis plants in there, if I called the state would say, sorry, we can't do anything about it. If you were to call the police, you can imagine that the way that police have to use the limited resources they have to be really mindful about how they spend those resources. So our program, fortunately, does have the administrative authority to enforce over-limit grows. And there has been a development pretty recently. Oregon had a medical marijuana program for a long time before recreational cannabis became legal. And so there were times when our code compliance officers would visit a site and they would say, well, I'm registered with the Oregon Health Authority as a medical grow, you can't touch me. And the Oregon Health Authority was bound by patient confidentiality to not share if those locations were registered as a producer. That has recently changed, which will make it a lot easier for local jurisdictions to communicate with the state and simply say, hey, we have this address, we don't need any identifiable information, we just simply need to know, is this address registered as a medical production site? So that'll make it easier for us, and we can come in administratively with a up to $5,000 per day fine if we were to find that someone were growing cannabis without a license. And then one last point, you touched on the butane hazards. We had a house in Portland a couple months ago that did explode. They were open blasting butane cans, essentially puncturing them and trying to produce BHO. And so the Fire Bureau, and of course we are extraordinarily concerned about this. The Fire Bureau has now submitted to our government relations office a request that Portland really put some pressure on the legislature to look at how to perhaps regulate the purchasing of those butane receptacles. And with our licensing, with our commercial processors, it's imperative that folks who are producing cannabinoid extracts using butane, propane, or hexane, that they have all of their permitting in order, mechanical, commercial building permitting, everything, before they get their license with us, which is not a requirement that the state has. Again, they look to the local jurisdiction to uphold those building and those fire codes in many instances. So those are some of the things we've been thinking about.
And in Denver, we've had a big challenge with the home grows. It's been something we've struggled with over the last couple of years. The first sort of regulations we put in place to address that was in Colorado, each individual has the authority or the ability to grow 6 plants per adult, but we said that through zoning, nobody could grow, no matter how many adults you had in one house, no more than 12 plants. So more than yours, but still, no more than 12 plants in one home. And then we also banned home hash oil extraction, except there's a few exceptions if they're using alcohol and in small batches, I think batches of 12 ounces. So that really helped cut down on the home explosions we had seen. Another issue we were having is our neighborhood enforcement team, who was charged with going out and enforcing these, weren't always feeling like that, that they were safe going into a situation like this. And by the way, we do this on a complaint basis only. So if we get a complaint, our neighborhood inspection services were going out. They weren't really feeling comfortable oftentimes going into homes like this that were doing these illegal grows. So they would partner with the DPD, with the Denver Police Department, and now at times Denver Police Department might just go out on their own, and they have authority now to write the zoning violations. Mm-hmm. And I know you guys are going to hear a lot more about this. I think in the law enforcement section, they're going to talk a lot about it. But what we found is it's still big. It's still a big problem. So now we're really looking towards that education piece, because when we used to get a lot of complaints about it, we're not getting as many complaints anymore because we think people are thinking, well, it's legal, there's nothing I can do. So we're looking at developing a PSA, a public service announcement, so people understand what is illegal, and if their neighbor has a bunch of marijuana growing in their backyard, that is illegal. In Denver, it has to be grown if it's at home in a totally enclosed locked space. So we're hoping that through education, where we can have, get reports and have more information about these home grows, and then through our coordinated inspection, or perhaps DPD doing that enforcement on that zoning issue, we can get a handle on it, but it's been a real challenge for us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So David, any follow-up on the home grow stuff?
No, I think it's great to hear your experiences in more detail.
All right, and Brandon, you have the last question before we turn it over to the audience.
Yeah, cannabis regulation, I think that all of us could say that we wish we could have done some things differently when we first started, right? I mean, it's a learning experience both for regulators and for the cannabis industry. So I wanted to ask David, Betsy, Ashley, what your top recommendations would be, both kind of in the policy development, how you considered cannabis and its impacts, and then in its implementation. Your top recommendations for other jurisdictions here that could be helpful as they're charting their path forward. David, maybe we can start with you.
I think what was most successful about our work in Seattle was the interdepartment cooperation and bringing all the departments together very early on in the process, walking through initial ideas, getting the ideas from the staff, and creating a program that all folks were interested and engaged in. It was probably, I think, our single greatest. And also just engaging with the new or prospective industry folks to get their perspective. They have the actual industry knowledge that we can rely on. I think there was, It's hard to tell who's a good player or not, especially early on. We were very fortunate in Washington State to have a self-regulating association that we could rely on because they've been good actors and very public about how they were trying to comply with laws. And so those kinds of folks, if you can reach out and engage with them to find out what's the best way to regulate, and then also, of course, good communication with the state regulatory body as well. That can be fits and starts, but the more you know how they're approaching things, line up how our own regulatory system so that the industry isn't facing two sets of agencies talking about the same topic in two different ways. I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think taking a page from that, we have a monthly meeting with interdepartmental meeting. Most of our medical marijuana regulation is run through the Department of Health, but the chair of that monthly meeting is at the Department of Health. But at that monthly meeting, we can all get together and talk about issues like pesticides and the environmental regulations or the fire hazards and regulating the distillation process, DMV and impaired driving issues or restoration of driver's licenses, MPD, of course, all the business people from DCRA about what happens if, restaurants that have a no smoking policy have people smoking marijuana in them, does that apply? All these legal issues just keep coming up. So I think having an interdepartmental focus, however you structure it, is really important so that it's not just one department's issue, unless your one department like you encompasses all those areas. And I think that another piece of advice would be sort of proceed in a very measured way, because it's harder to shut down than to open up. So we have 5 dispensaries and 8 cultivation centers, and we're opening up a couple more in neighborhoods that are underserved for dispensaries, but we're proceeding very slowly. Like you look at Detroit and they have like 286 dispensaries and it's clustered along 8 Mile, and that would be too much for DC. So we're moving slowly. And I think that makes some sense, but I think you need to move with all your agencies at the same time. Like, it's not fair if somebody opens up and then they get slammed with really tight security regulations. You need to think about what the security plan has to be before they get their license, rather than telling them, oh, and you need cameras and lights and this and that and the other. Just tell them what the specs are in advance, think it through. And then my second point would be, if you can set aside some money for messaging. We don't have money coming in because, as I said, we don't have legal sales. So it's hard, but the messaging is tough that, kids, it may be legal for your parents to do it, but it may not be healthy for you, or it may not be good for your grades, or don't drive and smoke pot. These messages are hard when it's becoming more socially normal, but there can still be consequences to your education or your career or something. So if you can do some messaging, I think that's important. That'd be my advice.
Yeah. And I think our top advice from Denver would be really to figure out how you can get that funding. How can you be well funded so that you can appropriately manage this and implement it? Right before retail marijuana went into effect, we went to the voters and asked for that additional 3.5% sales tax, and that has really been just key to us being able to do what we need to do. With that, we've hired over probably about 60 employees, 60 new employees throughout the city, throughout the different agencies, whether it's in police or fire, environmental health. So we really do have the expertise and the boots on the ground to do this. Then the way we do that coordination, I mentioned it earlier, but we have, we meet very regularly. I mean, very regularly, even though we're 3 years into it, we're still kind of not backing off of that, being aware and coordinating, because we still hear something new every day, just about. And so how we do it, just briefly, we have our small team of 5. We meet for an hour every Monday, and then the next hour, we have all of our different partners join us. So we have somebody from police, fire, environmental health, CPD, sometimes budget joins us, and our communications people join us, and our city attorney. So that's the second hour. then once a month we have a sort of citywide meeting that, rather than being those sort of point people on it, it's the employees, it's the boots on the ground from each of those agencies. And maybe at those meetings we'll have 25 to 50 people, and that does include Treasury, and it does include 311, and it includes other sort of ancillary technology services attends that, ancillary businesses, ancillary agencies that are also partners with us in this, and that is the one where we really hear something new every day. And then we have every other month we meet with sort of senior staff from the mayor's office. And then another very, very important component is once a quarter we meet with the industry. And we call that our industry check-in. And what we've learned is we can't regulate them if we don't know what they're doing, you know? And if we do know what they're doing and we do know what the new processes are, we do know where the new technology is going, we hope that we could work with them proactively together as we move forward with regulations. That hasn't always happened. A lot of times we learn they're doing something after they've already started to do it. But at that meeting, that's where we say, here's your chance, bring us your innovations, tell us where you're going. And we've said, we'll keep that quiet if you need us to, if it's proprietary, but if we can help anticipate those regulatory needs and help be out in front of it, it will benefit you rather than you going forward and doing this and then us coming back and saying, that's not right, that ventilation is not good enough, or that hood is not good enough. So I think that's, the key for us has been to have the funding and the tools and the people to help get it right, and then to have that collaboration.
Yeah, I think you three hit on a lot of what I was going to say, so I'll keep my response relatively brief. I have a saying that I just scribbled on my notepad right now. Engage, coordinate, educate. David mentioned engaging with the cannabis industry is critical. Remember that many of these folks, their operations up until legalization have been done outside of the legal regulatory framework. They may not be comfortable asking questions at first. They may not know where to go for resources, so engaging with those folks is really important, as is coordinating with your partner bureaus and agencies. If you're at the city, engaging with the state, vice versa if you're at the state level, and being able to try to conceptualize where are the different points on which cannabis regulation is going to hit for these businesses as they go through that process. Coordinate with those folks very closely and try to have that those frameworks built out as far ahead of time as you can. And last, to educate, make sure that you are providing that information in a way that's accessible and available. Make sure that the rules and best practices are clear and consistent. My view is that if we're asking the cannabis industry to spend money and jump through hoops in order to get regulated and to discourage people from staying in the unregulated market, then we ought to make those rules as clear as possible and make those processes as easily navigable as possible, so they have the best chance of success and to follow all of those rules. So that would be my advice.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, well, now we have about 30 minutes left for questions. We've got microphones, 2 microphones, I think, 1 here and here. So what questions do you have for us? All right, yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Dean Mims. I'm from the city of Gainesville, Florida.
Is that mic working? Can you guys hear him? Yeah. Okay.
Is this better?
Yep.
Yes.
My name is Dean Mims. I'm from the city of Gainesville, Florida. It's a university-dominated town of about 250,000 if you throw in the county unincorporated area with it. And in the state of Florida, it's medical marijuana only. It has been totally preempted. Local authority has been totally preempted by recent state legislation. And that's just a little bit about Florida. But my question for a representative from Denver here is this. You mentioned $10 million in sales tax money, and it sounded like another 20-something million in other revenues. So if you could just tell us a little bit about the other revenue sources. And that's a pile of money. Now, you have a lot going on here, but I'm just really curious as to, what those sources are. If you could tell us that, I'd appreciate
And
it.
great question, and that will be dealt with. I think we're going to have one breakout session, and we're going to have our budget director here and a couple of other people here to speak about that. But we have our regular sales tax on medical marijuana and our regular sales tax on retail marijuana. Same sales tax that we have on other goods and services in Denver. Then on top of that, we have that 3.5% special sales tax. Plus we have application and licensing fees. So that whole pot of money was $36 million last year, and it goes straight into our general fund. We don't have anything earmarked specifically for marijuana and marijuana regulation, but so we soft dedicate that piece that comes from the 3.5 million. So it's all, that whole $36 million went into our general fund, and I know it sounds like a lot, but it's still only about 3% of the overall revenue in our general fund. And you know, it goes to do everything that government does, fill potholes, pay for libraries, pay for police, but that one section, that $10 million, is soft dedicated for marijuana-related expenses.
Impressive. Thank you. I look forward to the rest of the conversation at a session. Thank you.
Great,
Bye.
thank you. Okay, yes, sir?
Good morning. My name is David Woolsey. I'm City of San Jose in California. And we currently have 16 medical marijuana collectives that we regulate in our city. And they are allowed to do deliveries to patients that we regulate. We have GPS cameras in the car, a couple of other things. But one of the things we're contemplating for January is allowing deliveries to adult use customers. And I wanted to know from the other states, do you allow deliveries? And if you do, how do you tackle reliable age verification for an otherwise anonymous purchase by an adult consumer?
We, in the district, I'll go first, we don't have deliveries, but we have authorized caregivers. So if someone's too ill to get to one of the medical marijuana dispensaries, they can get an authorized caregiver to pick up their medicine.
So we don't have legal delivery in Washington State. As a city, we have been advocating for that for the last 3 years because it has been our experience that is where the illicit market has gone. And until our licensed retailers can compete, we'll never really get at that illicit market. In terms of confirming, like things we've batted around, the proposals we've developed is there's app services. I think Ease operates in California. They have a great system of verifying someone's identity. But I think the key for us was very, almost no strikes and you're out penalties for the retail stores themselves. So if they ever get caught and there would be a system of auditing, our Liquor and Cannabis Board's very good at doing these kind of underage sales kind of stings, they would have a suspended license immediately for those kinds of sales. And so that kind of threat of losing your license, I think, is the linchpin in our opinion moving forward.
Yeah, both the state of Oregon and City of Portland do allow for recreational delivery. Much of the regulation of that delivery happens on the state side. So my understanding is that if you were a consumer making a cannabis delivery request, that the driver would have to verify the identification of the person who is receiving the product upon delivery. So absent having that state-issued, government-issued ID, then you would not be able to receive the cannabis, much as the same way as if you were to go to a store and you have to show your ID. So there's a direct connection between the driver and the recipient. And much as David said, the penalties if a company were to run afoul of those regulations are relatively severe. My understanding, they could lose their license at the state level if they weren't following the rules.
Well, and then we're the anomaly. So Colorado does not permit delivery, and in Denver, obviously, we don't permit delivery either. And we did have a bill at the state last session, and it was one that we affirmatively opposed. I don't think we've opposed many bills, and I don't think we've opposed many with regard to marijuana, but that was one that our city affirmatively opposed delivery. We just felt like, we're still so new, we're still rolling this out. We feel like, we're working hard enough to get our hands around what's going on at the licensed facilities that we weren't quite ready for delivery.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay.
Dan Kramer, City of Longmont, Colorado. Question primarily for Betsy, since you brought it up, the Drug-Free Workplace Act. Could you talk a little bit more about that and what, in your mind, might be best practices for municipalities trying to address the equity issue within their own organizations, but under the constrictions of that law?
Well, I don't know that I have best practices. You're nice to ask me. The Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act was passed in the 1980s, and it requires all federal contractors and grantees to certify that they're a drug-free workplace, to post signs, to have tests, and have it in their handbook that the drugs at work are not allowed, and including not just the possession of drugs at work, but you can't be using when you're there. So it comes up. It's pretty prominent in Washington, D.C., because we do have a lot of federal contractors in the district, and some federal law applies to the district. So, it's hard in terms of equity because we want to be strictly compliant with the law. So if we have big federal grants, like on various human services programs or homeland security programs, we have to include it in our grant agreements that the grantees will comply with the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act. And so all we can do is just, let people know that this could be a real consequence, and that's why I keep emphasizing education, that there's a contrast in law that's somewhat of a legacy from the war on drugs that's still on the books, and the current normalization of marijuana. Of course, different companies comply with it with different levels of rigor. So like in the district, for our kind of parallel to that for the Children and Youth Safety and Health Act, the entities just need to have a plan for drug testing, and we don't fill it out for them. Their plan might be we randomly test one person every 6 months. It doesn't mean you have to test every person upon hire and every person every 3 months. You just need to have a plan. So we ask, can we see your plan? And whatever their plan is basically good enough, but they have to have made a plan. So that's one way to address it. And then, I think suspicion-based testing is going to be a lot more fair for most positions than random drug testing that's not based on a suspicion or an incident, but that may not be good enough in some highly safety-sensitive industries. I don't know if that's helpful. Hope so. Thanks.
All right. Yes?
Hi there. Yes, Tim Stiles with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which I believe is like the National League of Cities. I'd like to circle back to the issue of home grow. And maybe a bit of clarification, because in Canada, we're grappling with this right now. Legalization is coming in supposedly in July 2018. And I have a lot of members who are saying, don't get involved in home grow as a municipality. Don't go there. It's not worth it. How would you license it? And I'm hearing that there's a kind of a range of options across the board. Is it true that there's state licensing and municipal licensing for home grow? And then in the case of Denver, you've said it's just on a nuisance complaint. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the contrasting views on that, and kind of learn from maybe some best practice there. Thanks.
So, and I can just start from Denver's standpoint. The reason why we have home grows is that's what the voters voted for, and when they passed Amendment 64. So that's what the hand we were dealt, a legalized commercial market plus home grows. And no, we don't have a licensure around it, and we're just, as I said, regulating it as we can based on complaints. So.
DC is similar to Ashley's situation. We legalized home grow through an initiative, and probably like a lot of the public servants in the room, it's like, well, we'll implement the law, whatever it is. I guess it's part of people's liberty to have home grow, and if people were otherwise buying on an illegal market, at least they know what pesticides they've put on their plants or what they've cut it with, to go back to the opening talk by the president of Acela. If you grow it at home, you're not going to put on some poison on top of your plant that could be harmful to you. So it's part of people's liberty. We don't license somebody to grow it at home. There are limits on it, but we don't ask people to come forward and tell us whether they are or are not growing it at home.
In Washington State, medical patients with a medical authorization can grow without a license, but they don't have arrest protection. So they would have to defend themselves in court that they were complying with the law if an officer decides to arrest them and the prosecutor decides to prosecute them. If you do register with the state, I believe it's the health department, you will have that arrest protection and you'll be in a, but it's not a licensing system. And it's what the state the Liquor and Cannabis Board is currently considering that licensing program. I think there's a lot of concerns around that, and in terms of privacy in the home and the things I've touched upon earlier.
So right now it's a voluntary then?
For medical, yeah, it's voluntary. If you want to have the benefit of not being arrested by police, that gives you security in your home. If you're growing marijuana, then yeah.
Yeah, important distinction between the medical and the recreational. So for medical, if you're a medical patient, you are registered with the Oregon Health Authority as a patient. It allows you to grow a certain number of plants at your home. And then also if you are a caretaker for other medical patients, then you'd have to register that location with the Oregon Health Authority. And that's what I was speaking to earlier about us communicating with the Oregon Health Authority about where those locations may be. On the recreational side, that 4-plant limit, you don't have to register or get licensed. That is just a right that consumers have. It was part of Measure 91 when it was passed in Oregon.
And I guess, and finally, from Denver's point, we feel like we've got a really good handle on the licensed market. Home grows, not as much. Yeah. And so we've really, you'll hear it when I think the law enforcement panel will talk about that, and the home grows really are the source of legal diversion and a number of our problems. But with you all licensing nationally, I don't think you'll have that same level of concern with people, wanting to send it to another state like we do here. Yeah. Thanks. All righty.
Good morning, Joe Devlin with the City of Sacramento. A few years ago, we dove headfirst into cannabis. We have 30 dispensaries in process of right now finishing out our regulations for, we're beginning to permit cultivation and manufacturing and delivery and so on. My question is around the equity piece though. We've begun those conversations in Sacramento, beginning to build a model. My question is, have you set aside actual capital? If so, how much and what process? And if I could ask a second question around the home grows, what is the legal mechanism that you're using for entry into the home? Is it an inspection warrant, or are you having to obtain criminal warrants around all of these? Thank you.
Sure, for the equity piece for Portland, yes, a portion of that 3% local tax is going specifically to efforts to be seen through a restorative justice lens, the record clearing and expungement, right. Small business support, internships for women-owned and minority-owned businesses, as I described earlier. And so that portion right now is $500,000 for this fiscal year. Wouldn't be surprised if that went up in coming years.
Are they going to do actual grants?
So it's the decision on how the money will be allocated. Those decisions will be made by the steering committee that's being convened right now. So those decisions haven't quite yet been made. It's our anticipation will be in early 18 when we'll know more about exactly how that money will be allocated. With respect to entering the home for our program, or the cannabis program, we only have administrative authority, so we can request to enter a location. We can't go in without the property owners or the business owners or the homeowner's permission unless we were to receive an administrative warrant. It's different for law enforcement, of course, but for our program, that's how we've been able to approach it.
For Seattle, home grow is illicit, and so we do need we do acquire criminal warrants in order to enter the homes. And that's one of our major concerns of moving forward with home grow, is how much more difficult it might be to obtain those warrants. How do you make a determination whether someone is growing within the legal, from the outside of the building, legal amount of plants that are allowed versus over that amount? And it would require a much more significant investment of, I think, police and city resources to monitor houses, to see if there's ongoing traffic, maybe acquire, power records, those kinds of things. So that's our concern, one of our major concerns moving forward.
We don't have a dedicated line for some of those equity considerations, but different departments are approaching it in different ways. And we're about to have an open period for 2 more distribution centers for medical marijuana, and there's been a little bit of a delay so that we could get in place, have time for potential applicants to get small business certification for the points that are awarded for being a minority-owned or small business or woman-owned business or otherwise disadvantaged, long-standing local business, that kind of thing. So those two new distribution centers are going to be in the lower income wards of the city, and we're hoping that through the additional point system that we'll be able to encourage minority ownership or disadvantaged person ownership. But we have so many programs for getting returning citizens back into the workforce and apprenticeship programs and one thing or another. So hopefully through some of those training programs, various entrepreneurs will be able to set up businesses in the many allied areas for disposal of the waste or the correct types of fertilizers or anything like that, the packaging, labeling, that kind of thing. There are going to be a lot of businesses beyond the very few cultivation and distribution centers. And so that's what we're putting in place there. Fourth Amendment applies to going into homes, and that's basically all we've had. Our DCRA, that our Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, that does inspections, just hasn't had a lot of complaints, and they do have administrative powers consistent with the Fourth Amendment for inspections, but really they're so tied up with the things that neighbors really complain about. I mean, the basic construction permits, raised permits, that kind of thing, and then the neighbors are always complaining about, oh, somebody's building a porch that goes too close to the lot line or whatever, and they're tied up with that. We just aren't having a problem with that I've heard about, and I'm on the phone with these people about neighbors complaining that someone's growing 6 marijuana plants, but we don't have this massive home grow situation where someone's trying to really run a farm inside their house. I think they're just like a few little plants.
So with the equity piece, I mean, we did not have any caps on marijuana businesses when we first started, and so that's why we have 1,100 licenses. One of the things after we got out there and had a lot of licenses and started thinking maybe we should put caps in place, we have put caps in place. We put them in place about 1.5 years ago, and one of the thought is we'll have these caps in place. Once we dip below the caps, we'd open it up for a lottery system, and in that way maybe that would be a pathway for other people to get into the market rather than just perpetuating the same people who are in the market already. And then the other piece on home grows, I think ours is the same as yours. You'll hear more about it in the next session, that right now when it's neighborhood inspection services, it's just an administrative, well, first they would request if they could enter and maybe some type of administrative warrant, but if it's law enforcement, they would need a warrant. That's what I think, so.
You do.
Okay.
Thank you.
All righty.
Good morning.
Hi.
I'm Mike Russell from Portland, Maine, and we're waiting for some regulations to finish coming from the state, but in the near future. We already have medical marijuana. My question's around the home grows and around the safety part. You mentioned some about banning butane and some other pieces. In my department, the fire department, are very concerned about the safety of our inspectors going in and, of course, other tenants who would be next door. So can you talk a little bit more about the efforts you've made to ensure the safety of the employees as well as the tenants in the building when it comes to home grow?
Well, so the first thing we did in Denver was we banned home hash oil extraction. So hopefully, and I think right before we did that, we legalized in January 2014. By that summer, we had seen about 30 home explosions throughout the state, maybe 8 in Denver. We then passed the prohibition on home hash oil extraction, and since then we've seen very few. So that really helped and that really worked. We do have concerns about the health and safety of our inspectors for a number of different reasons and means. Whether it's like, going into a place that it's storing hazardous materials, storing excess butane, and these are in the licensed facilities as well, but the CO2, do, and then also them being exposed to molds and mildews or other toxins. So we have, and I don't think she's going to speak at this event, but we worked closely with that whole collaborative model with someone from our risk management department, and she set forth safety protocols that I think are probably online somewhere, and she based the safety protocols on what is the level of contact that certain employee would have with marijuana. So if it's an officer going into a home grow and pulling out the marijuana and throwing away the weed, there's a higher level of PPE required for that than whether if it's an excise and license inspector just going in to make sure your cameras are where they need to be. But we've done a real deep dive into that, and I think we can probably get you detailed information on that.
Great.
Okay.
Has Seattle and Portland dealt with that as well?
Well, important, and Ashley was right to, we're separating the home grow piece of it from the processing piece of it. When you're talking about butane, that's when you're talking about cannabis processing, which, is not allowed at the home. And frankly, our program hasn't had the tools yet to be able to identify where people are processing in the home. For example, we have seen, Craigslist ads that advertise, butane hash oil for very low prices, and ostensibly this activity is many times taking place, outside of the regulatory framework, or completely outside the regulatory framework, and it's been difficult for our program to be able to connect, those Craigslist posts, for example, to an actual address and a person. And so that's part of the challenge for Portland, is working more closely with law enforcement who may have those tools to investigate those kinds of instances, so that we can then come in on the back end and handle it administratively. So that's been our experience.
Well, Seattle, we have a listed home grow, so we're not trying to regulate, make those kind of things safer, but it is a concern. We haven't had, fortunately, many BHO explosions, but we have had fires as a result of electrical problems. One was, there was a fire underneath a child's bedroom, and so it's a huge concern for us moving forward. We also have concerns making sure our licensed folks are meeting our electrical needs, and we literally had a transformer melt because of the overload related to two licensed grows in a building. So it's a continual struggle to make sure folks are getting the right permitting and building the right electrical systems to meet. And so our fire department is very engaged in doing their inspections and helping us on that part.
Great. Thank you.
Good. All right. Any other questions? Yes. Yes, sir.
Good morning. Kat Packer with the Department of Cannabis Regulation for the City of Los Angeles. Curious to know, lots of folks have independent offices or departments that have been set up. Curious to know how you all have structured the allocation of personnel resources, how you're using the various staffing in your offices, how your org charts essentially are set up.
Sure, yeah. The City of Portland has 7 dedicated cannabis program staff. 4 of those staff are code compliance, so they respond to complaints, they do inspections. If there are temporary events, they'll have a presence there, things of that nature. And then we have 3 administrative staff, administrative and policy. So myself, involved in policy discussions and team leading. We have a licensing expert, essentially, who handles from the intake through the verification of the application through completion, does all that verification and administrative coordination. And then we have a dedicated administrative coordinator who helps us with our internal policies and the structures that we use to keep our program organized. And it should be said that there are, outside of our program, there are resources being dedicated to cannabis, right now in other bureaus, the Fire Bureau, Bureau of Development Services, the Revenue Bureau, the Alarms Unit with the Police Bureau. All of these folks have staff who have other obligations who are dedicating a portion of their time to cannabis-related work. And so, moving forward, I think Portland is interested in learning how to better coordinate and perhaps even offer some funding support to some of these other agencies and bureaus so that they can have staff that are dedicated specifically to cannabis. But in short, our program, 7 staff, 4 code compliance, 3 administrative.
So we've had an informal interdepartmental team. that I helped convene the different departments, and early on we were meeting weekly. And then it was bi-weekly, and then it was every 3 weeks. And now we decided to integrate into our long-standing code compliance team instead. And so that these issues have really flatlined for us in a lot of ways, which is really fortunate. And so that, I think, we'll see how there's a new administration coming in the next couple months, and how they want to continue to structure it. But having the mayor's office lead staffer, which I've been, has been a key component in able to bring these departments together to get their attention on it. And I think having that kind of executive authority is really important.
You know, we are very thinly staffed in terms of dedicated staff. We just got our first dedicated staff person this year, this quarter, I think. But we've had, of course, people who work in medical licensing more generally, and grants management and procurements and inspections, and people across agencies devoting some share of their time to marijuana, and certainly the lawyers writing up regs and promulgating them and posting them, and the legislative staffers working with council. But we are just getting our first full-time dedicated person now.
And as we got started, as I said, there was just 5 of us in the mayor's office, and when we were really sort of looking at our bare bones structure, what we thought we needed was me doing mostly policy and outward facing issues. And then we had another deputy manager who just kind of oversaw operations. Then very key was our data analyst. And then a city attorney was assigned to us pretty much full time, and she wound up having a bunch of lawyers assigned to her ultimately, and then our communications director. So those were sort of a foundational sort of nuts and bolts for us just to be able to do what we do. And then like David did, David said his was more kind of informal, coordinating with other agencies. Ours was probably much more formal, and calling those other agencies, those other individuals, whether they're firefighters or police officers or inspectors, calling them part of our marijuana team, even though they work with other agencies. And actually, I think one thing that also sort of helped us from the city level when we're managing differently than managing just one department, kind of trying to manage over different departments. One thing our budget office set up is those departments would prioritize their budget request every year, and maybe police would ask for a certain number of officers here, 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 and here, and lower on their list would be officers to work on marijuana. Then the budget office gave us those lists, whether it's police and environmental health or fire, and we, for marijuana purposes, would then say, where's our priority? And so the chief, when he prioritized officers lower on his list, we prioritized it higher on our list for marijuana purposes. And even though they obviously still would report to their agency head, we had some ability to try to get those funded appropriately so that they could help us from a policy angle.
Can I build on it?
Yeah.
Do you have health education in the schools relevant to this, or how do you get curriculum out or talk to your teachers and anything about DBH? Like I saw that opioid use is going down in Colorado as marijuana is going up. Are you intentionally trying to get people off opioids and onto marijuana, or?
Thank you.
I think they'll talk about that in another session. But I would say a third of that, when we talk about that 3.5%, that money, we use a third of it for regulation, a third of it for enforcement, and a third of it for education. So we've put forth a lot of dollars into education in a number of different capacities. So yes, and then we also provide some money to Denver Health to do some of the monitoring of what the statistics are looking like.
Thanks.
All right, well, it's been a long morning, so why don't we go ahead and just break early.